Climate Smart Farming Program Specialist. We're really excited that you all made it out here, and we really see our program at CAF as a great opportunity to, amplify conversations like this that are really an interface between the interests of farmers as well as environmentalists. Not to mention our broader general public, right? This is a public issue of climate change. So without going on too much here, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel, and what I'm going to ask actually is the panel to introduce themselves. But just briefly, Jessica Chartis is here with us. She's a soil scientist from UC Davis. She's currently doing research out at Russell Ranch, which is a long-term research facility that does these long-term research projects looking at different aspects. Jessica's work, particularly interesting for this conversation, she's doing a lot of work on soil carbon down there. David Johnson, obviously at this point you need no introduction. And Keith Abels is with Sonoma RCD. Sonoma RCD, as well as Napa, Mendocino, and Goldridge, I believe, are working together along with other RCDs in California to really promote carbon farm planning. And he's going to be able to tell us a little bit about that. Paul Kaiser, I also doubt needs an introduction, but Paul Kaiser of Singing Frogs Farm here in Sonoma County, had a really innovative intensive no-till vegetable production model that many people are calling sort of organic 2.0. So the first thing that I would like to ask the panel is to go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about, your work and sort of your interest in being part of this conversation.
Okay, so I've already been introduced, but I'm Jessica Chartis. I'm a PhD student at UC Davis. As Sarah mentioned, I'm doing work at the Long-Term Agricultural Research Station out there. Basically, it's looking at different management systems, so different nutrient management systems, different irrigation systems, different crop rotations. And what's pretty novel about it is not only is it a large-scale agriculture operation, so the experimental plots are actually 1 acre in size, but it's representative of the farming operations that are going on in the area. But also the sampling goes up to 3 meters deep. So as you mentioned, you like to do the top foot. A lot of research in carbon sequestration tends to go maybe to 15 centimeters, maybe 30 centimeters, which is good, but if you can get a little, soils are open systems. Carbon moves at depth through a lot of different mechanisms. Whether it's from the roots themselves or other mechanisms like preferential flow paths, what we call bioperturbation, so organisms actually moving around in the soil. They don't know that you're only sampling to 30 centimeters, so they don't cooperate so well with that. So we're looking to 3 meters deep and analyzing the change over time. The experiment was set up in 1993, so my sampling is actually looking at 20 years of management. And I guess, should I mention this now? The results have shown so far that the organically managed systems, which receive composted poultry manure, were the only ones that were significantly able to sequester carbon in this Mediterranean arid climate where you have tillage practices going on. They, in the 20 years, they sequestered 20 megagrams of carbon per hectare, which seems small now compared to what you've just shown. But if you look at the other management systems, they're either staying stagnant or which for our systems, since they've been so highly cultivated for so long historically, they're already below saturation. They're already slightly depleted in organic matter. And so these systems aren't doing anything to bring them back up to baseline. And some of them are actually continuing to deplete over time. So my interest in this, actually, just to give you a little bit of a personal account, I started off my post-college career in corporate sales, and I was selling pharmaceuticals, selling antibiotics, started to kind of go down the wormhole, so to speak, learning about the implications of our overuse of antibiotics. And getting into nutrition, all these different things. And the funny thing is, the more questions you ask about anything related to nutrition, environmentalism, socioeconomic justice, the more times you come back to soil. And so that's what makes me a soil nerd.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Keith Abels, and thanks for having me here. I work with the Sonoma Resource Conservation District, and we work on soil and water health and all types of different projects. So I'm the water resources specialist there, which means different things at different times. I have been involved with the groundwater management planning efforts, but I also spend a lot of time out at vineyards doing irrigation system evaluations, and now getting more involved with the Land Smart Ranch planning, which is going to lead to a discussion about the carbon farm planning you mentioned. Until a month ago, I owned a farm, Quetzal Farm, which is a 10-acre vegetable farm in Santa Rosa, and fortunately another really good young farmer bought that, and he'll be continuing that, so we're excited about that because I and my former business partner, Kevin McInnes, we've been at it for a long time, and it was time to move on, and I've been at the Resource Conservation District for a few years. I did come to Sonoma County 20 years ago to farm with Left Field Farm, which was an organic vegetable farm too. I've been involved with sustainable agriculture really since college. I went to UC Santa Cruz and became interested in the late 80s, and it's weird. At the time I thought like a lot of things had been going on for a while, but looking back now I realized that was kind of the front edge of a lot of things and some of the people I was working with. And what's interesting to me in your question about like why am I interested in this is when you look at what is carbon farming and you look at what is it, it's low or no tillage, it's cover crops, it's compost, using manures, it's preserving the soil, planting woody shrubs and trees. It's a lot of the same things we do for farming anyway. It's really more looking at it from a different lens or doing it in a different way to enhance those benefits, because if you look at farming, it's sort of it's the problem and it's the solution. I think there's a lot of people are having trouble finding solutions to how do you deal with carbon sequestration, how do you really do it. Farming creates a lot of issues, especially in the larger scale farming and breaking up soil and the chemical inputs and whatnot can be issues. But at the same time, farming is the answer, and some of the studies that have been done in the last 10 years, show that when you keep, good production, you keep soil covered, and you look at the whole picture, a lot of those places are the places that are sequestering carbon. And so I think we need to look, further and further into what are the opportunities for small, medium, and large-scale farms to make that contribution. And I just find it's really interesting, and it's very much in its infancy. So there's a lot to be figured out. There's a lot of research, that still needs to be done, and there's a lot of answers I think we'll find. But it's exciting to come out today, and I was thinking, there's gonna be 40 or 50 people here, and I walk into the room, there's like 150 people. It's hot. I'm like, I better pay attention here. So thanks for having me, and I assume there'll be a chance to talk more as we go on about the carbon farm planning and some of the stuff we're doing at the RCD that's relevant and exciting and interesting.
Just a quick introduction. My more significant half, Elizabeth Kaiser, is not here this evening. She wanted to be and was hoping to be. Babysitter had to cancel last minute. So when our farm is introduced, it is the two of us. We are co-owners and co-operators, and she does an amazing job. I really appreciate her presence on the farm. So David, I think one of my favorite brief little quotes and comments you made was, there's only so much carbon you can put in the soil, but there's no limit to how much soil you can put on the land. And that's a great way to look at things. We can keep building soil forever, even though there's a limit to the actual carbon per unit of soil. So what also impresses me, I have to say, is my background was in the hot, arid, dry tropics in ecological restoration and land work. And that's where you are doing a lot of your research trials, is I assume at about 5,000 or 6,000 feet elevation in a desert, which isn't just a hot, dry desert, but then it has winter snow and ice and below freezing temperatures. So about the only perennials you get are mesquite and a few other things. It's a very limiting kind of climate to grow in, and one of the most challenging on the planet. And while I was in the hot, dry tropics in West Africa and parts of South America, we didn't have those freezes in the winter that limited things, so we could grow year-round for sure, and the hot, dry tropics were a much easier environment than the Southwest at elevation. And as you mentioned, the fungal content of the soil is highly important, and many scientists have done that for a long time. The question is, how do we get to that point where we have that fungal content in our soils to begin enhancing the growth and returns on our crops that we care about? We don't want to be growing the weeds and the grasses. We want to be growing the vegetables and the fruit trees, etc. So creating those conditions that really enhance the growth of those plants is the challenge that we all face. And there are many wonderful, innovative systems out there that I love coming across all the time. So, thank you.
Any of you guys can hang on to that at this point, or just put it down. So I'm just going to ask a few questions, and we'll hear from the panelists, and then we're going to, throw it out to the audience, and so be thinking about questions that you all have. One of the questions that I have that I think is, brought up a lot that you just brought up, touched on, all is, we're talking about these practices. Most of them aren't new. You can look up cover crop research from 1905, for example, that are finding similar results to research now that is considered novel, which I find entertaining. But obviously there are some barriers here to farmers actually adopting these practices. Not just one, but what if, what's the importance of adopting one of these practices like compost or cover crop or no-till versus adopting a number of them and seeing the interactions of them? And if you guys could speak to that, and also speak to what are the practical limitations people are up against? What are the barriers to adoption that we're seeing that we really need to focus on? Whoever would like to go first.
Oh man, I've been nominated. This is something I think a lot about, actually. What makes people change? What makes people think to try something different, especially when they have such risk? They're literally betting the farm. So obviously, especially in our climate, there's water constraints. And that, to me, is a big, big issue in terms of research gaps. So we talk about this 1905 having research on cover crops, and now we're still doing stuff and it's considered novel, and yet no one's looking at the actual water usage on farm of cover cropping. We talk a lot about cover cropping increasing soil organic matter, and we know that there's this relationship between soil organic matter and water holding capacity. So it stands to reason that if you increase your soil organic matter, you should be increasing water holding capacity. Less loss of water from the system, the increased infiltration as well even, so you have less runoff and less stuff going literally off the farm. And yet there's a huge research gap on this, that you have anecdotal evidence, but no one's actually looked at how much can we save water, like actually doing a water budget on farm. And seeing how much, whether or not this fear of using too much, the cover crop using up your water for your cash crop. So I think that's a huge barrier because we haven't demonstrated it well enough. And then something that's near and dear to me is just the systems of adoption that we generally use. We were just talking about this. There's this very linear line of education that's built into our culture of, teacher to student, parent to child, scientist to farmer, and we're not enlisting the farmers themselves in being advocates and telling their stories and demonstrating their success. And again, just to harken back to my days as a pharmaceutical rep, we were clever. Unfortunately, they're clever, and so we would find a thought leader in the medical community, a doctor who was prescribing our drug for a specific indication, and we would pay them to come out to an event like this where we'd invite other doctors, and they would share their practice and kind of give this proof of concept that instead of someone who's never practiced telling you what to do, it was your colleague, someone who was relatable, and so adoption rates were high. And I think that's something we need to model in agriculture as well. You know, we need to get the farmers telling the farmers rather than someone in a suit or a lab coat. So those to me are the two predominant things that are prohibiting progress.
I'll say money and time. I think those are the two biggest things I see, because a lot of these things, well, some of them, you know, like a farmer might do anyway. They're going to cover crop because they cover crop. And here in the North Coast, we're fortunate because we can plant before Halloween and it actually grows. We don't need to necessarily put water on it. A lot of agriculture doesn't have that luxury, and agriculture not far away from here. But a lot of the things to do, you know, take money and time, and they take risks. And the problem is, like, you know, we've been talking about this for 20 years. I used to work for CAF, and we were talking about it, you know, 20 years ago, like how we're going to pay farmers for ecological services that they provide. And there's people working on it, and I think there's been a little progress, but when it comes down to it, the farmer has to foot the bill. You know, yes, the NRCS does do some supportive programs, but that's got its own complications, or you know, you have to be willing to like work with the system the way that works, and that has its constraints. But when it comes down to it, like, you know, a lot of people, if they want to have a hedgerow, they need to pay for it, and the hedgerow will provide benefits like beneficial insects, or, you know, erosion control or windbreak, but it's hard to monetize that or to see the direct benefit of that. And so a lot of times a grower will be like, yeah, I'd love to do that, but unless someone's going to pay for me, I don't think I'm going to do it. And I think even more so, a lot of people just don't have time. I mean, they're so busy. I mean, look at this year. All the farmers are a month behind because of the weather. I'm not going to put down the weather. It's been great. I love this winter, but it's hard for people because everyone's like in a bind, and they're running and they're racing. And at the RCD, where I was in the business of trying to talk landowners and into doing things, you know, into doing projects, and a lot of people are like, yeah, that's great. I'd love to do it, but, you know, call me back in a month, call me back after harvest, call me back, you know, sometime later. And I understand that, you know, as having farmed, you know, a bunch of time in my life, there's a lot of reasons why planting the hedgerow or changing your system or doing the research, you just don't get to it. Or you always have the best intentions, you're like, I'll do that in the winter, and then winter's over, and you haven't done it. I think the last thing I'll say about this is sort of risk aversion. Farmers are habitual. If you create a system or inherit one from someone, you know, like your father or whoever farmed there first, if it's not broke, you don't want to fix it. You know, you don't want to mess with it. And so, you know, like I work a lot with, you know, vineyards, and, you know, a lot of them till every row, some of them till every other row, and then there's some, you know, smaller group that don't till, and there's a lot of arguments about which is best. But if you try to say, hey, just, you know, like, why don't you why don't you stop tilling? Well, you got a big discussion on your hand, because they're putting it all, you know, they're putting it all on the line, and no one's paying them to do it. They're taking the risk, and that's huge. I mean, what if it didn't work? You know, and a lot of farmers are convinced that, well, I have to do that because the weeds or the cover crop competes for water with the vines, and, you know, I can't do that, and because then I'll lose my water, or, you know, the vines won't do well and it won't produce, and I need to get 2 or 3 or 4 tons or whatever their goal is per acre. And if I can't achieve that, you know, obviously there's a number of vineyards that can afford that. Some perceive they can't afford that, and then there's a bunch that actually can't afford to do that, you know, and so they have to make it work. And so I think until there's more incentives, there's more sharing the risk. I mean, if the community or society shares that value of, like, we need to sequester more carbon, that's great. But the next step is to back that up with support and money so that they can actually do it, and you don't have the average farmer taking all the risk, and if it doesn't go well, paying the price.
Definitely, and on the positive side, change does take time. And what I have found definitely that leading by example and farmer-to-farmer visits and identifying people who are doing excellent practices and getting other farmers to visit those practices is a big inspiration to getting change to occur and change to happen. But a lot of times we also find our farm I glossed over Singing Frogs Farm in my intro, but we are an intensive, no-till, agroecological vegetable farm here in Sebastopol, about a half hour away. We are really highly productive. We use a lot less water than we used to, and our organic matter has gone up from about 2.5% up to 8, 10, 11, 12% organic matter. Carbon increases as well. And we used to, when articles first come out about us, one of the biggest slams against us is that we used to test in the top 12 inches of our soil, and they all say that you're supposed to test in top 6 inches only, as you said, and our response was, great, we'll test the top 3 feet instead. So now we're testing 3 feet deep and finding even better answers down there. It's really awesome. So what we have done with our success is turn that model of farmer-to-farmer visits over into our way of expanding. People ask us constantly if we want to scale up, and our version of scaling up is to get more farmers doing what we're doing, or even better than we're doing. And we're having great success at that through workshops, through farm tours, through presentations, etc. And it has been, just yesterday I did a full all-day workshop with a Hmong farmer group from Fresno and Gilroy Demonstration Farm, and then a few farmers from Ohio and Nevada and Northern California. And it was our 4th workshop this spring, and despite the heat wave. But we are really enjoying the opportunity to help other farmers get up and running and have as good or better success than we're having from day one. And I think that's where change comes in, is change is hard, no question about it. And we are getting the best traction with new farmers who are just about to hit the ground running, and they find out about our system and they quickly adopt it and hit the ground with a very different system than they intended and have great success. So it's the next generation coming on that is finding great success, and it's easier to have change there, but we are still having change amongst all farmers of all ages and experiences, and it's been great. I know there's a few farmers in this room that have actually have worked for us. Chris, I'm thinking Jaster, and a few others who have worked for us and now have their own businesses up and running, doing great, doing a no-till, productive, intensive systems. So.
Yeah, and David, did you want to comment on that?
Oh, sure.
You don't have to.
I think we need to see a full cost accounting of what agriculture really cost us, our impact on our environment. It's going to have to eventually, I think, end up in a market, because most farmers can't afford to make this transition. They need assistance through the process, and once they get through the intermediate part, then once they adopt it, we have farmers like this that are bright and shining examples of how it's done right. It's that transition that's going to be tough. And the carbon market, that is, I hate to say it, because some people like it, some people don't, maybe the only answer to really get this thing to move forward. And I'll caveat that with, I was recently in Australia with Terry McCosker, and they have a carbon market. They have money in the treasury to support this. And maybe 2% of the ranchers will come look at this, and only 0.5% will actually adopt it and get into the market. So just because we have a market may not be the total reason that it will go forward.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one other thing. I agree socioeconomics is probably the main driver, but there is also an issue of inconsistency with carbon sequestration research, inconsistent results. And we have this addiction to scalability. And with soils and agriculture, we have to be systems thinkers, and we have to really have a sense of place and think about the unique considerations of that location. And so I think we need to approach our research questions thinking about things like, what soil type is it on? How much clay, for instance? And actually comparing like to like, rather than just kind of doing across the board and then having someone on completely different system having poor results and then saying, oh, well, it all must be wrong. We probably have to think about the unique considerations of each location. So.
I know everybody loves to hear an academic say we need more research. We do. We need good enough numbers that this is reliable to our policymakers. I'm working with Peter Bick and Richard Teague on a project that they're trying to put together. We're looking at rangeland management, and this does function in rangeland management as well. Richard Teague has demonstrated 3 tons per hectare per year increase in soil carbon in rangeland in central Texas. So this can be done in dry land as well. If you saw Gabe's, he was doing that in North Dakota. And you can see he was having significant increase in his soil carbon as well. But it takes reliable enough data for our policymakers to move this forward. Oh, just one thing. My co-inventor is back in the corner over there. Wait, Jim, you can wave to everybody and say she's a good balance to me. She challenges me on everything. So.
Balance is important in all systems, right, including people systems. So I'm really glad you guys commented on that. What you said, Paul, I just want to mention, CAF is actually working with Singing Frogs Farm on this different kind of scalability, and we're sort of sponsoring these different farmer groups from different regions that are dealing with a different climate and a different soil, and trying out this model, adapting it how they see fit, and trying to really amplify what works with farmer innovation. You know, what results can we see? Because as Jessica mentioned, you know, especially in California, we have incredibly diverse ecosystems, and all of our cycles are going to be a little bit different in these different ecosystems, depending on, you know, what the temperature is. You know, Davis, where I live, it's extremely hot in the summer, so very different from Sebastopol, unfortunately for me. But moving on to another question around sort of looking forward and land management. Soil carbon sequestration, you know, from what I understand, is a very complex topic, especially when we're talking about long term. So I think one of the biggest questions to think about, if we're actually trying to sequester carbon to mitigate climate change, we need to think about it long term. And I would like to hear from you all about some of the challenges in planning for land use management that is actually targeting carbon sequestration for the long term. So whoever would like to. Didn't like that one, huh?
Well, long-term planning is hard in farming because there's so many variables involved with farming, you know, and it starts, you know, right there in your soil, but as soon as you go out the gate, you know, what's the price of gas, you know, what's the consumer mood, what's popular, what's not. You know, at Quetzal Farm, about 5 years ago, we got this killer virus that did in our tomatoes, and tomatoes used to be our biggest crop at one point. We got around that and we dealt with it, but it took a few years to recover. But you know, farmers need options because you never know what's going to come at you from where, or what you might get excited about, or just what change, you know, is demanded of you, whether it's your choice or not. And so, I think it really depends on the site you're farming at, because if you're on a tight acre, you can't really think long term because you're going to need space for your rotation. You know, you can't, I mean, you need all that space. If you're farming on an acre, you're not going to be making necessarily a lot of money, so you're going to have to maximize it and be really intelligent. And what makes a lot of money now might not later. I mean, we used to grow padron peppers and get $20 a pound for those. Well, those days are long gone. So, you know, you have to make changes. And so I think if you have the right site where, you know, some sites have wooded areas and forests or margins or fence lines that they're never going to plant because they need it for, you know, for whatever reason. Those areas become good for carbon sequestration, especially for like long-term woody plants. When I think long-term, I mean, switching to no tillage is a good long-term strategy, but like in terms of woody plants that sequester carbon, that's a really strong way to accomplish that. But then do you have the space to do it? And what if you plant a hedgerow and then, you know, 12 years later you realize you need that space because of one of these variables. You might have worked yourself into a corner, which, farmers at one level, I say they're habitual and they're stubborn. At another level, they need flexibility, because otherwise they'll get sunk by something.
Don't know that I've wanted the microphone yet, but we definitely, there's a lot of variation in farming, and we have put in a numerous quantity of hedgerows and perennial woody, twiggy, native shrubs on our farm, and I will never regret that decision and never pull them out. But they are not my main carbon sequestration on my farm. What we are aiming for at Singing Frogs Farm is to make our vegetable production what improves the soil. And we have done PLFA and other microbial soil analyses in our roadways and in our vegetable beds 30 feet away. And our roadways have permanent grass on them, but it's not composted, it's not watered, and it's not harvested. It's just annuals, clovers, and annual grasses, and some perennial grasses in the roadways. And we'll test for microbial life in those soils and the fungal bacterial ratio. We will also test 30 or 40 feet away in our vegetable beds. So our baseline is our undisturbed soils. And what we find is in the crop production soil, where we're actually growing our economic crops, we have 3 or 4 times the amount of microbial life and a much better fungal bacterial ratio with no stress in the system and great predator-prey ratios between the nematodes and everything else. So in fact, our very act of growing vegetables, the way we grow them, improves the soil dramatically over soil that's untilled, undisturbed, and unused. So by using the soil, we have made it better. And that's the system that we need to start focusing on. And that's what all human modes of production need to start thinking about, is how do we start changing our modes of production so they don't have negative externalities, but rather have positive externalities. So that by the very act of producing something as humans, we make the world better, not worse and more challenging. So that's where we want to go with that. And I think the vegetable production for us is what we focus on. Gabe Brown, up in North Dakota, I'm always thoroughly impressed. One of our employees last year is now his employee this year, and that employee is getting a nice world tour of some pretty cool farms. But Gabe Brown has brought his organic matter up from 1.9 to 11 or 12% on 3,000 acres in the Dakotas, where you only have half the year to grow something, and half the year you're under snow. I mean, that's impressive to me. So again, many, many, many awesome examples around the globe at all different levels of production, where you can build back soil, sequester carbon, increase fungal bacterial ratios, et cetera, and get better productivity and better return on your investment out of it. So.
Here, here.
So in terms of thinking long term, I'll give the science perspective again, sorry. But we've only recently had a paradigm shift in the way we even think about soil organic matter. So for the decades prior to now, we've been thinking about it in terms of chemical lability or recalcitrance. So is it easy to break down or is it hard to break down? And we're just now realizing that it's more about the physiochemical properties of the soil itself that kind of are barriers to whether organic matter will stick around and stabilize or whether it will be mineralized to CO2. And so we've been asking questions in a different sort of way in the past. And so again, this goes back to maybe we need more research, which is hard to hear. But thinking about things differently, thinking about building structure so that things are easier on the microbes so that they're more efficient at converting carbon in the system. Also, a lot of our measurements in the past have just been looking at CO2 respiration, and so we assumed if the respiration rates are higher, this one is not sequestering carbon. But in fact, that's not a hard and fast rule. Increased CO2 respiration means potentially that you have more microbial activity, more biomass growing, and we now know that soil organic matter is 50 to 80% microbial necromass, so just a bunch of dead microbial bodies. And so we need to start thinking about systems that increase microbial growth rates and turnover, so that, because they actually become the organic matter. So rather than looking at respiration rates, we need to be looking at, as David showed, specific respiration rates. So how much respiration per unit carbon consumed. Because, and that's something that I think people can understand, because we all think about efficiencies. How do you create more efficient systems? We didn't just create a car and then stop there. We tried to find ones that were more efficient at using fuel, right? And so I think we need to take that same approach onto the farm. Another thing is thinking about depth, as we've mentioned, because like you're finding, you're actually potentially increasing carbon even more at depth, especially in these irrigated systems where, especially, and depending on your quality of your irrigation water, you could actually be taking that CO2 respiration that microbes and roots are producing and moving it downward and reprecipitating it as inorganic carbon, so carbonates, which are much more stable. They're not going to be decomposed by microbes in the same way that organic carbon would be. So I think just from the researcher perspective, thinking about how carbon dynamics work in the system differently, thinking about how a change in management might kind of invalidate years of sequestration, and that's where, especially in these climates, I think looking at systems that put carbon at depth is really important, because it may be less vulnerable to management and more likely to be stabilized because you have more of these reactive mineral surfaces, so clays and iron and aluminum oxides that will stabilize and hold on to that carbon. So things like perennials, deep-rooting plants. We've been breeding plants for above-ground biomass. Maybe we need to think about breeding plants for below-ground biomass. So just changing the way we think about things now, it takes time. Now the science and the practices have to follow suit.
So I'm going to stop with my questions there and actually turn it out to the audience. And since we're using the mic up here, I'm going to try to listen really carefully and repeat your question. So whoever wants to ask a question to the panel or share a comment, please do. Now's a good time. Yeah.
I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
So my comment is I'm with Demeter US, and I'm just really happy to share with this group that this year we decided. We were going to start measuring soil organic matter on all the biodynamic farms. So every year when an inspector visits a farm as part of their annual inspection, they're going to be taking a soil sample from the production field, measuring it for soil organic matter, and we hope to use that data both to work with the farmer over the years.
Like an ice cream.
We hope to use that data every year to work with our farmers to help them have a tool to help them pay attention to building soil carbon. And I was really impressed with your numbers. I mean, seriously, Paul, that's pretty awesome. But in addition to that, being able to aggregate that data to give voice to power about the ability of biodynamic and regenerative, of course, agriculture to really impact climate change. And yeah, Sonoma County has the most biodynamic farms in the country. In fact, 10% of the biodynamic farms in the country are here in Sonoma County. Some of them are in this room, so it's something for us to be proud about here. That's my comment. My question is, this is awesome, and we just spent 2 hours talking about it. How do you talk about it in 30 seconds or less to the average consumer? And so my question for you guys is, do you know about the 4 per 1,000 initiative? And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because I actually think it's a simple way to talk to people about it. But I'm really interested, David, in how you feel about the data behind that.
So just to repeat the question for folks that didn't hear, she's asking about, well, we just spent 2 hours talking about this obviously complex subject. How do you boil it down and deliver it in 30 seconds? And you asked about the 4 per 1,000 initiative. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, I presented at the National Press Club for the 4 per 1,000, this research. And they have lofty goals, but it's achievable if we have to look past the carbon and look at the biology. Carbon is part of it, yes, but it's the biology that makes all this function. It's the biology that's changed this planet. It's the biology that will change this planet again. It's an energy equation in these soils. They're just like us. Without energy, we're cavemen. Or women. Add a little more energy, we have population increases. A little more energy, we'll have specializations. A little more, we start to have mutualisms, and eventually we achieve synergy. It's realizing what that microbial community structure is that makes all this work. And it would be interesting to see you do that, you look at that on your farms as well. In fact, if you have some of the, was it the A500? I would like a small sample so I can do a metagenomic analysis on it and compare it to see what I'm coming out with in this composting process.
Right, we'll be happy to get that to you.
Okay, we'll change names after this. Okay.
Okay, we have a question from Terry. Terry Harrison.
Yeah, I want to comment on the cost. If you get half or a quarter additional crop using only half as much water, what's the cost barrier here? There isn't any. And farmers are slow to adopt new things, but if the economics are as good as David has described, and farmers start looking over the fence and seeing what their neighbors are doing, eventually will, and hopefully it has to be pretty soon, because of global warming, will reach a tipping point.
Absolutely, thank you, Terry. Yes. You can shout it to me and I'll try to repeat your question.
All right. So I'm interested in the role of tillage as it relates to carbon sequestration, and I'm particularly interested in tillage during a transitional period. What is the appropriate role of tillage? Since a lot of people are using it, it's kind of hard to maybe wean off of that. And personally, I'm an apple grower, and I'm interested in perennial systems. What is the appropriate role of tillage?
So, great question about the appropriate role of tillage, especially in transitioning from tillage to less tillage to no tillage. We have an apple farmer here. So, tillage and perennial systems, would you guys be able to speak to that?
Patience. And as little as possible on the tillage. No recreational tillage. The biology will do it. The biology will open that soil up. Once you have earthworms working in there for you. To give you a comparison.
You tilled in your system, though. I'm curious why in some and why not in others.
Okay, I tilled in mine.
Decision-making framework is what I'd love to hear about.
Yeah.
Why can we till, when might
You know, every location is different. I think we've established that. I tilled in mine because I'm in a desert environment. I'm looking at 115 degrees in the summer. I'm looking at humidity levels at 10% or less. I lose an inch of water a day in an area that only gets 9 inches of water a year. So it doesn't work for me to leave that on the top of the soil. It's too dry for the organisms to come up and break it down. The sunlight breaks it down. It blows away. So in that case, I chose to disc it in. I chose to disc it in as shallow as I can, to disturb it as little as I can, to try to preserve the community structure of all the microbes. And if you saw that, that's a nematode, most massive animal on the planet surface. Gotta give these guys their credit due here also. And all the protozoa, you saw some pictures of those. They're all important in this, and you have to preserve that community structure completely. But patience, I know it's tough, because the bottom line is the bottom line.
You ask a great question. I mean, I think tillage is maybe one of the most important questions to be asking, and what we need is answers. So we do need research, even though I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academic. More research is definitely needed, and I want to tell you just a little bit about something we're doing at the RCD that I'm actually very excited about, because I go out to these vineyards all the time, and you see these three different patterns: till everything, don't till, or alternate row tillage, which has become, I think, more popular, that alternate row tillage I see the most. And so I always ask growers, why do you do this? You know, it's maybe not even relevant to why I'm out there. Why do you do this? Why have you made this choice? And so you get a lot of growers, well, we have to do that. You know, we have to do it because, you know, otherwise we lose all our water is generally their reason. Or, oh, you know, if I do the alternate row, then I get the benefits of both situation. But I've never actually seen a study, and I've certainly not seen one for the North Coast vineyards or North Coast anything that actually talks about it. I mean, I found, like, you know, corn growers in Kentucky or, you know, what have you, and that's nice, you know, something in the Midwest, but it's not what we got going here at all, and it's not the same equipment, it's not the same crop, etc. So we have a project that the NRCS just funded where we're setting up 3 treatments: alternate row, full till, and no till, and we're gonna do this for like 2 seasons and hopefully get funding for more. And we're gonna put soil moisture probes, working with Mark Greenspan, put soil moisture probes right in the middle of rows, and then we're gonna do these tractor rows with those different, do 3 repetitions of each, and of those 3 treatments, and we're gonna measure that each year and see what are the curves, because I have a feeling you'll see something where there's actually more water than you think, and then maybe at some point then you'll see that change over to where there's less water, where there is cover. But I don't know, everyone has an idea, and some people have extremely strong ideas, but you know, the proof will be in the data. The other thing we're doing, we're working with Josh Beniston from the soil scientist at the JC, and he is going, you know, he's going to help us with the science experiment. We're out there actually taking soil cores, and I will say, as a quick but relevant aside, is the cores we took from the tilled area were actually much harder to auger. And you know, it wasn't easy yesterday with the heat, you know, it was bad timing, but they were much harder than the rows that weren't tilled. And I thought, oh, maybe the tilled rows would be easier because they've been tilled, but they were significantly, like, obviously harder to auger. And then sure enough, you get to a certain point and it was pushing all the rocks to like where the plow pan is. And so that was making a difference. So once again, that's anecdotal, and I want the numbers to tell me. I don't want to make too much of a judgment. I want to do the test and see what it is. So we're out there yesterday taking these soil samples, and what we're going to do is we're going to have these baseline now. What's the bulk density of that soil? What's the, you know, what texture is it? What's the bulk density now? What's the water holding capacity now? What's the carbon content now? And then in 2 years, after we've done these treatments with different cover crops, we're going to take a look at, you know, where's it at then, and see what kind of changes. Now 2 years, as you know, isn't necessarily enough time to see those changes, so we're going to try and figure out a way to fund this beyond. And we're also going to, you mentioned earlier, there's this Mendocino Soil Health Initiative that's the Mendocino RCD is leading, that's going to be in our county, Napa and Mendocino, and we're going to be setting up demonstration sites. We're going to be doing, you know, different types of, looking at some of these different practices, holding workshops. You asked the question, I'm wondering how we're even going to give the message to growers who already know a ton of stuff about this. I don't know how you do it, put it into a 30-second soundbite, but when you figure it out, please call me and tell me, because, you know, this stuff's complex. But we're going to use that other project I'm talking about, and we're going to try to build on this project I'm telling you about, and you know, and then we can go to the growers, and instead of them saying, well, we got to do it this way, we can start saying, well, here's what we found, and farmer to farmer is everything. I think, you know, a farmer's not going to, they're going to listen to a farmer before anyone else. And you know, we used to do a lot of that with CAF workshops, and half, you know, like 40% of the workshop would be the presenter talking, and then most of the time the farmers were just like blah blah blah, because they all want to like talk, share notes, and talk about this stuff. And that's what gets them excited. And I think what you're talking about, you know, Paul's got a good model there. If he can get 100 farmers in his lifetime to do this, and then they get another 100 each, well, maybe then we'll start to see some benefits.
Thank you, guys. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end the questions on that note. We're out of time here. All right, one thing I can't say.
I have looked at this in a conventional soil. They were out ripping it in the field one day. They were in granny gear, and it was black smoke pouring out of the pipe. I had them come over and do one rip through my second gear, straight through, after 3 years. So it takes. Research, 2 years, won't do it.
Start there.
It's a start.
If any of you are not happy about what the government did with your taxes, I do have 501(c) that you can donate to.
sorry, this may be slightly unpopular, but I just want to say, again, I think there's parallels in society of this, of having to be extremes, like you're a vegan or you're paleo, you're left or right. I think that tillage is a tool in the toolkit and it should be used appropriately, like you said about recreational. They've done studies on deep plowing in the Central Valley and shown that actually it increased carbon significantly at depth, that turning of it stabilized a whole bunch of carbon deep down. If you are not getting your roots penetrating deep into the soil because you're not tilling, then you need to be thinking about potentially allowing yourself to have that. And like you said, it takes time. The biology isn't going to come back overnight. Yes, earthworms, yes, cover crops like daikon radish and things like that can create these pathways that allow your roots to be able to get where they need to go. But you can't just invalidate it off the bat, and you have to take this "it depends" approach of, are you on a really clayey soil, and are you using equipment that's compacting things? And we just can't be so black and white about things.
Agreed. All right, well, let's give a big hand to all of our panelists.